Chapter 4. Paul's Childhood. Paul's figure was rather small and slight, like his mother's. His fair hair gradually became dark brown. His eyes were grey. He was a pale, quiet child who seemed old for his years. He was sensitive to what other people felt, especially his mother. When she was upset, he understood and could have no peace. About this time, the family moved to another house near the top of a hill, commanding a fine view of the valley below. After dark, Paul used to go out to play under the street lamp with the other children of their street. Then, when the miners stopped coming home from the mine, he ran fearfully back to the kitchen. The lamp still burned. The fire shone red. Mrs. Morell sat alone. Steam rose from the cooking pot. The dinner plate lay waiting on the table. The whole room seemed to be waiting for the man who was sitting in his coal dirt, dinnerless, a mile away from home across the darkness, drinking himself drunk. When Morell did come home, everyone in the house kept quiet, because he was dangerous. He ate his food roughly, and when he had finished, pushed all the pots away to lay his head and arms on the table. Then he went to sleep, heavy with beer and tiredness and bad temper. Morell was shut out from family events. No one told him anything. He was an outsider. The only times he entered family life were when he found jobs to do around the house. Sometimes in the evening he mended boots, or the kettle, or the metal bottle for cold tea, which he took every day to the mine. Then he always wanted helpers, and the children enjoyed helping him. He loved telling young Arthur stories about the little horses that the miners used down in the mine. But these happy evenings only took place if Morell had some job to do. Then he always went to bed early. The children felt safe when their father was in bed. Mrs. Morell had given most of her attention to William, but when he went to work in Nottingham and was not so much at home, she made a companion of Paul. The two brothers were a little jealous of each other, but at the same time, they were good friends. Friday night was baking night and market night, because the wages were paid on Fridays. It was the rule that Paul should stay at home and watch the bread in the oven. He loved to be by himself and draw or read. He was very fond of drawing. Mrs. Morell enjoyed her marketing. The marketplace was always full of women shoppers. She usually quarrelled with the cloth seller, chatted with the fruit man, laughed with the fish man, was coldly polite to the man selling pots. But this time, a little dish decorated with blue flowers caught her eye. He told her it cost 7p. She put the dish down and walked away. Suddenly the potman shouted, "Do you want it for 5p?" She was surprised. She bent down and picked up the dish. "I'll have it," she said. Paul was waiting for her. He loved her homecoming. She was always at her best, tired, happy, weighed down with parcels. She dropped her parcels and her string bag on the table. "Is the bread done?" she asked, going to the oven. "The last one is baking," he replied. "You needn't look. I haven't forgotten it." "How much do you think I bought this for?" she said, taking the dish out of its newspaper wrapping. 1 shilling and 3p, said Paul. 5p. The two stood together admiring the dish. She unfolded another piece of newspaper and showed him some little flowering plants. 4p for these. "How cheap!" he cried. "Yes, But I couldn't afford it this week of all weeks. Yet she was full of satisfaction. They were very poor that autumn. William had just gone to London, and his mother missed his money. He sent 10 shillings once or twice, but he had many expenses. He wrote to his mother regularly, once a week. He told her all his doings, how he made friends, how he was enjoying London. All day long, as she cleaned the house, she thought of him. He was in London. He would do well. William was coming home at Christmas for 5 days. There had never been such preparations. Paul and Arthur decorated the kitchen with green leaves. Annie made pretty strings of coloured paper. Mrs. Morell baked a special fruit cake, a big rice cake, little cheesecakes. Everything was decorated. A great fire burned. The smell of fresh baking filled the kitchen. William was due at 7 o'clock, but he was late. The children had gone to the station to meet him. Morell sat in his armchair, full of nervous excitement, and Mrs. Morell quietly went on with her baking. Neither one spoke. They waited and waited. At last, there was the sound of voices and footsteps. "He's here!" cried Morell, jumping up. The door burst open, and William came in. He dropped his bag and took his mother in his arms. For 2 seconds, no longer, she held him and kissed him. Then she stood back and, trying to be normal, said, "But how late you are!" "Aren't I?" he cried, turning to his father. "Well, Dad?" "Well, my boy?" Morell's eyes were wet. "We thought you were never coming." The 2 men shook hands. "Everything's just as it was," said William, looking round. Everybody was still for a second. Then he leaned forward, picked up a newly baked biscuit, and put it whole into his mouth. He had brought them endless presents. Every penny he had spent on them. For his mother there was an umbrella with gold on the handle, which she kept till her dying day. There were pounds of wonderful sweets, quite unknown in Bestwood. Everybody in the family was mad with happiness. People came in to see William, to see what a difference London had made to him. They all found him such a gentleman, such a fine young man, my word. When he went away again, the children were in tears. Morell took himself off to bed, and Mrs. Morell did all her housework mechanically, robbed of all feeling for days. Chapter 5. Paul faces life. Morell was careless of danger. About a year after William went to London, and just after Paul had left school, before he got work, a great piece of rock fell on Morell's leg when he was working in the mine, and broke it in several places. He had a very bad time in hospital. For a week, he was in a serious condition. Then he began to mend. Knowing that he was going to recover, the family began to worry less, and to be happy again. Mrs. Morell talked to Paul almost as if she was thinking aloud, and he listened as best he could. In the end, she shared almost everything with him. Together, they learned how perfectly peaceful the home could be. Paul was now 14 years old and looking for work. His face had lost its boyish roundness and was rather rough-looking, but very expressive. He was quite a clever painter for a boy of his age, and he knew some French, German, and mathematics. He was not strong enough for hard physical work, his mother said. He did not care for making things with his hands, but preferred going for country walks or reading, or painting. "What do you want to be?" his mother asked. He had no idea. "Anything." "That's no answer," said Mrs. Morel. But it was the only answer he could give. "Then you must look in the paper for advertisements," said his mother. He copied out some advertisements and took them to her. "Yes," she said, "you may try." He used a letter which William had prepared for him to write to the different companies offering jobs. His handwriting was terrible. William wrote from London in a kind of fever. He seemed unsettled by the speed of his new life. His mother could feel him losing himself. He wrote of dances and going to the theatre, of boats on the river, of going out with friends. But she knew he sat up afterwards in his cold bedroom, studying Latin and learning all he could about the law, because he wanted to improve himself. He never sent his mother any money now. It was all taken, the little he had, for his own life. Mrs. Morel still dreamed of William and what he could do, but in her heart she was worried. He also wrote a lot now about a girl he had met at a dance, Lily Weston. His pet name for her was Gypsy. She was young, beautiful, very well dressed, and much admired by men. His mother congratulated him in her doubtful fashion. She imagined him tied to an expensive wife. "I'm very likely an old silly," she told herself, expecting the worst. But the worry remained that William would do the wrong thing. Soon, Paul was asked to go for an interview at Thomas Jordan, maker of medical appliances, at 21 Spaniel Road, Nottingham. Mrs. Morel was delighted. "You see," she cried, her eyes shining, "you've only written 4 letters, and the 3rd is answered. I always said you were lucky." Paul looked at the picture of the wooden leg wearing an elastic stocking that appeared on Mr. Jordan's notepaper. He had not known that elastic stockings existed. Mother and son set off one very hot morning in August. Paul felt extremely nervous, but he refused to tell his mother, and she only partly guessed. They travelled the 16 miles to Nottingham by train. Mother and son walked down Station Street, feeling the excitement of lovers sharing an adventure. They turned up a narrow street that led to the castle and found the Thomas Jordan sign. They went through a big doorway into an open space full of boxes and packing stuff, and up 2 lots of stairs. In front of them was a dirty glass door with the company name on it. Mrs. Morel pushed open the door and stood in pleased surprise. They were in a large workshop with thick paper parcels piled everywhere, and clerks with their sleeves rolled up, calmly going about their business. "Can I see Mr. Jordan?" she asked one of the clerks. "I'll fetch him," answered the young man, and went to a glass office at the far end of the room. A red-faced old man with white hair came towards them. He had short legs and was rather fat. They followed him to his office and were told to sit down. "Did you write this letter?" he asked Paul, holding it up. "Yes," he answered. "Where did you learn to write?" Paul simply looked at him, too ashamed and nervous to speak. "And you say you know French?" asked the little man sharply. "A friend gave him lessons," said Mrs. Morel quickly. Mr. Jordan hesitated, then pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and passed it to Paul. "Read that," he said. It was a letter in French, in strange, spidery foreign handwriting, which was very difficult to read. Paul struggled with the words. "Please send me 2 pairs of grey cotton stockings without fingers." "Without toes," the factory owner corrected him. "Stockings don't have fingers." Paul hated the little man for making him look stupid. "When can he start?" Mr. Jordan asked his mother. It was agreed that Paul would be employed as a junior clerk at 8 shillings a week. As he followed his mother down the stairs on their way out, she looked at him with her blue eyes full of delighted love. On the Monday morning, Paul got up at 6 to be ready for work. He had bought his season ticket for the train at a cost of £1.11, and his mother had packed his dinner in a small basket. She stood in the road, watching him as he crossed the fields to the station. Now she had 2 sons in the world, one in London and one in Nottingham. They came from her, and their work would also be hers. All morning she thought of Paul. At the factory, Paul was told to work with Mr. Pappleworth, an amusing man who was about 36 years old. Pappleworth showed him what to do. They had to read the letters ordering different appliances, note down each order in a big book, write out the exact details on a yellow order paper, and take the order to one of the departments to be made. Most of the orders were for elastic stockings or bandages. Later, he was introduced to Polly and the girls downstairs, and then Fanny and the girls upstairs. At 1 o'clock, Paul ate his dinner, and then he went out into the brightness and freedom of the streets until 2. In the afternoon, there was not very much to do. At 5 o'clock, all the men went downstairs and had tea. After tea, the gas lights were lit. Paul had done his paperwork, and now he had to pack up the finished goods in parcels, writing the address and putting the right stamps on each one. At last, he was free to grab his dinner basket and run to the station in time for the 8:20 train. His day in the factory was exactly 12 hours long. He did not get home that evening till 9:20. He was pale and tired, but his mother saw that he was rather pleased. He told her everything, all he had seen, all he thought, every detail of the experience. So the time passed happily enough. The factory was a friendly place. Nobody was rushed or driven too hard, and every Friday night he put his 8 shillings proudly on the kitchen table. Then he told his mother the happenings of the day. It was almost as if it was her own life. Chapter 6. Death in the Family. Arthur Morell was growing up. He was quick and careless, rather like his father. He hated study and hard work. He was the flower of the family, a well-made boy with fair hair, fresh colouring, and wonderful dark blue eyes. He had a quick temper and thought only of himself. He loved his mother, but she got tired of him sometimes. He had loved his father, and Morell still thought the world of him. But now, Arthur had come to hate him. His father's manners in the home got worse and worse. When they got too much for him, Arthur used to jump up and leave the house. He got so bad-tempered that when he won a place at the grammar school in Nottingham, his mother sent him to live with one of her sisters, and so he only came home at weekends. Annie was a junior teacher at Bestwood School, earning about 4 shillings a week. But soon she would get 15 shillings because she had passed her examination. That would make the financial situation in the home a bit easier. William was now engaged to his girl and had bought her an engagement ring. He wanted to bring her home at Christmas. This time, William arrived with the lady, but with no presents. Mrs. Morell had prepared supper. He kissed his mother hurriedly and then stood back to introduce a tall, handsome young woman, very fashionably dressed. "Here's Jip." Miss Weston held out her hand and showed her teeth in a small smile. "Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Morell?" she said. "I'm afraid you will be hungry," said Mrs. Morell. "Oh, no. We had dinner in the train." She looked round the kitchen. It seemed small and curious to her, with the green leaves decorating the pictures and the rough little table. Annie showed her up to the front bedroom where the parents usually slept, then returned to fetch hot water. After half an hour, Miss Weston came down wearing another fine dress. Morell pressed her to take his armchair beside the fire. The 3 children sat round in silent admiration. At 10 o'clock, she shook hands all round and departed to bed, led by William. In 5 minutes he was downstairs again, but he talked very little until he was alone with his mother. His heart was rather sore. He did not know why. "Well, Mother, do you like her?" "Yes," came the cautious reply. "She's not like you, Mother. She's not serious, and she can't think. Her mother died when she was a child. She's had no love. I know she seems shallow. You have to forgive her a lot of things." "You mustn't judge too quickly," said Mrs. Morell. But William remained uncomfortable within himself. Lily continued to play the fine lady. She sat and let Annie or Paul act as her servants. And yet she was not so fine. For a year now, she had been some sort of secretary or clerk in a London office. At Easter, William came home alone, and he discussed Lily endlessly with his mother. "You know, Mother, when I'm away from her, I don't care for her a bit. But then, when I'm with her in the evenings, I'm awfully fond of her." "It's a strange sort of love to marry on," said Mrs. Morell, "if she holds you no more than that." Paul's wages had been increased at Christmas to 10 shillings a week. He was quite happy at Jordan's, but his health suffered from the long hours and the bad air. His mother wanted to help. His half-day holiday was on Monday afternoon. At breakfast one Monday in May, Mrs. Morell told Paul that her friend, Mrs. Levers, had invited them to visit her at their new farm. It was agreed that mother and son would go that afternoon, a 4-mile walk. They set off in style. Mrs. Morell with the umbrella William had given her, because of the sun. After walking for a long time, they finally came to a group of low, red farm buildings. There were apple trees and a pool with ducks. Some cows stood under the trees. As they entered the garden, a girl appeared in the doorway of the house. She was about 14, with short, dark curls and dark eyes. She disappeared. In a minute, another figure appeared, a small woman, also with great dark brown eyes. "Oh," she said, smiling, "you've come then? I am glad to see you." She introduced the girl with the dark curls as her daughter, Miriam. The 4 of them had tea together. Then they went out for a walk in the wood. Both mother and son were thrilled by the beauty of the place. When they got back to the house, they found Mr. Levers and Edgar, the eldest son, in the kitchen. Edgar was about 18. Then the 2 younger boys came in from school. The boys all went outside and played games. Miriam watched but did not join in. She was very shy. Finally, it was time for the Morells to go home. Mr. and Mrs. Levers walked over the fields with them for part of the way. Paul was carrying a great bunch of flowers Mrs. Levers had given them. The hills were golden with evening. Everywhere was perfectly still. Mrs. Morell and Paul went on alone together. "Wasn't it lovely, Mother?" he said quietly. He felt almost painfully happy. William came home again with his young lady for a week's holiday. There was a feeling of sadness and tenderness in the house while they were there. But William often got annoyed. For an 8 days' stay, Lily had brought 5 dresses and 6 blouses. "Oh, could you please wash these 2 blouses and these other things?" she said to Annie. And Annie stayed washing while William and Lily went out. This made Mrs. Morell extremely angry. William read a lot and had a quick, active mind. But Lily found reading difficult. She understood nothing but love-making and social chat. She could not give him real companionship. "She wants to get married," he told his mother. "And I think we might get married next year." "A fine mess of a marriage it would be," answered his mother. "I should consider it again, my boy. Nothing is as bad as a failed marriage. Mine was bad enough, God knows." "I couldn't give her up now," said William. "Well, remember, there are worse wrongs than breaking off an engagement." Before he left, William remarked to his mother, "Jip's very fond of me now. But if I die, she'll forget me in 3 months." Mrs. Morell was afraid. Her heart beat wildly, hearing the bitterness in her son's words. He came home again in October, this time also alone. He was thinner than ever. He was doing extra work, trying to make some money to get married with. On the Sunday morning, as he was putting his collar on, he showed his mother an ugly red mark under his chin. 3 days after he left, a telegram came from London, saying that he was ill. Mrs. Morell read the telegram, borrowed some money, put on her best clothes, and set off. It was 6 o'clock when she arrived at William's address. "How is he?" she asked the house owner. "No better," she told her. William lay on the bed, his eyes red, his face discolored. There was no fire in the room. No one had been with him. He looked at her, but did not see her. He was quite unconscious. "How long has he been like this?" asked Mrs. Morell. "He got home at 6 o'clock on Monday morning and slept all day. The next morning he asked for you, so I sent you a telegram and fetched the doctor." The doctor came again. It was a chest infection, he said, and erysipelas, a rare skin disease. He hoped it would not get to the brain. Mrs. Morell settled down to nurse. That night, she prayed for William, prayed that at least he would recognize her. But his condition got rapidly worse. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he died. Mrs. Morell sat perfectly still for an hour in William's bedroom. When day came, she sent a telegram. "William died last night. Let father come. Bring money." Morell had only once before been in London. Nervously, he set off to help his wife. They returned to Bestwood on Saturday night, having walked from the station. In the house, Mrs. Morell was white and silent. All she said was, "The coffin will be here tonight, Walter. You'd better arrange for some help." Then, turning to the children, We're bringing him home. In the front room, Morell arranged 6 chairs opposite each other for the coffin to stand on. At 10 o'clock, there was the noise of wheels. Arthur held one candle, Annie another. Outside in the darkness, Paul could see horses, a lamp, and a few pale faces. 6 miners in their shirt sleeves came up the narrow garden path, holding the coffin high. "Steady! Steady!" cried Morell, as if in pain. The 6 men struggled into the room with the great wooden box. Paul saw drops of sweat fall from his father's face onto the wooden top. At last, the family was alone in the room with the great coffin. The mother was stroking the shining wood. "Oh, my son, my son," she cried softly. "Oh, my son, my son." They buried him on the hillside that looks over towards Bestwood. It was sunny. They laid a bunch of white flowers on the warm earth. William had been right about Lily. She wrote to Mrs. Morell at Christmas. "I was at a party last night. Some charming people were there. I didn't miss a single dance." After that, Mrs. Morell never heard from her again. Then, on the 23rd of December, Paul came home and gave his Christmas money to his mother with shaking hands. "I feel bad, Mother." She undressed him and put him to bed. He had a serious chest infection, the doctor said. Paul was very ill. His mother lay in bed with him at night. They could not afford a nurse. He grew worse, and the crisis approached. Realizing how much his mother was suffering, Paul used all his willpower to hold on to life, and finally he began to recover. He was in bed for 7 weeks, and when he got up, he was weak and pale. Mrs. Morell's life now fixed itself on Paul.